So far in my short YouTube career, half of my content has revolved around heavy criticism of a franchise that I supposedly love. I don't like that. I don't just want to complain about Zelda, I want to celebrate the games that made me love the series to begin with. I want people to know that I'm not just complaining because I like being angry or a contrarian, but because I love the series and want it to be better than it has been as of late. So while I made it seem like I was going to immediately talk about Breath of the Wild next, I think I owe it to both myself and this channel to balance the negativity with praise for the good games. And what better place to start than from the beginning? After all, if I want to talk about where the new games went wrong, I first need to establish what right is. I don't really know how to begin with this one. This is my favorite 2D game in the entire series. Whenever I bring that up with people, I'm always met with some amount of surprise, especially from those who are around my own age. It's not that it's unpopular to like this game, but I always get the impression that a lot of people turn their noses at it just because of its age. I get it. It can be hard to get into a lot of NES games, even the really popular ones. Lord knows the amount of times I've tried to play Kid Icarus only to put it down almost immediately, and don't even get me started on how not fun the original Metroid is. I don't blame anyone for playing the original Legend of Zelda for a few minutes, not knowing where to go, and giving up shortly after getting the sword. The game is just too confusing and obscure for modern sensibilities. But that obscurity is exactly why I think that this is one of the best games in the entire series. Zelda 1 rather infamously doesn't tell you much of anything when playing it. There's no tutorial, very little dialogue, and the few hints that you do get tend to be rather poorly translated. That doesn't mean you're left completely in the dark, however. The game's intro makes it plainly obvious that you're trying to obtain the 8 Triforce pieces and goes on to tell you to look at the included instruction booklet. This is probably the 4th time you've heard this in the past week, but games used to come packaged with a booklet that basically told you everything you needed to know about the game and then some. In Zelda 1's case, it also came with a separate insert containing a map of most of the overworld and detailed maps of the first 2 dungeons. It's actually kinda silly how many people tend to forget about this when talking about the first game, especially within the context of Breath of the Wild being the supposed return to form for the series. Zelda 1 isn't this outdated bog of crypticism. It actually tells you a lot about how its own mechanics work and how to travel the overworld, even giving you the exact locations of the first few dungeons. It's the specifics that it holds back from you. The dungeons in this game are a great example of this. I know, I went on a massive tangent in my A Link Between Worlds video about why the classic dungeon formula was a good thing, but that's because I think that game does an ineffective job at shaking up that formula. I love the classic dungeon formula, but I don't think that it necessarily needs to be there for a dungeon to be good. Case in point, I really like the dungeons in this game. The standard dungeon format in later games tends to revolve around locking you out of different locations until you obtain a specific item required to bypass said lock through puzzles or other designed elements, sort of like a mini Metroidvania. But in this game, the dungeons are more about utilizing your resources effectively while figuring out the correct path through labyrinthine gauntlets. Sure, you get a new item or two in each dungeon, and many of them are required to beat the game, but aside from the ladder, recorder, and silver arrows, none of them are ever required within their respective dungeons. Instead, the dungeons consist of repeated room templates that can be connected through the sides in different ways. You see an open door there? Cool, just get to the other side of the room. Is it closed? Well, that must mean you either have to defeat all the enemies, remember to push a block, or both. Is the door locked? Well, I guess you'll have to burn a key to get through it. Maybe there just isn't a door anywhere. Well, the manual does tell you that you can blow up some walls. Maybe that will work. Then again, you don't really want to use your bomb since you can only carry 8 and the enemy drops in this game feel really inconsistent, so the only way you can guarantee more is by leaving the dungeon entirely and buying them in a shop. You're not even completely certain that there's a room there unless you have the dungeon map, and even if you do, there's no guarantee that these 2 rooms are necessarily connected, so it might be a better idea to leave this room to try to find another way around. And for the vast majority of the game, there is another way around. Throughout the entire first 6 dungeons, you are only ever required to blow up a single wall. All of the other bombable walls either lead to optional goodies or can be circumvented by taking other paths through the dungeon. So why are those bombable walls even there? Well, like I said before, the dungeons in this game are about utilizing your resources effectively. Let's take a look at the first dungeon. There are 2 different bombable walls here, both in adjacent rooms. If you bomb the upper wall in the room to the left, you get to skip 2 rooms in the dungeon. At first glance, that might not seem like a big deal. The only enemies in those 2 rooms are Keese and Gels, and you can easily walk right past all of them. The only thing that taking this path costs you is a key, and most players already have 2 of them. In fact, there are 6 keys found throughout this dungeon and 6 locked doors to go with them. Any novice player will most likely assume that keys are handed out to any player that's thorough enough to find them, and while that's sorta true, you still have to go out of your way to find those keys, which requires backtracking and potentially forgetting where you are. Very quickly, any player will realize that keys are just as much of a resource as bombs are, and the game leans into this fact. Not only is this the only game in the series where the keys you find aren't only usable in the dungeons that you're in, but it's also the only game in the series where you can actually buy extra keys if you get stuck and can't find more. Now there's a reason to not only find those bombable walls, but memorize where they are and repeat playthroughs. Using bombs, you can skip 2 locked doors in level 1, all 3 of the locked doors in level 2, another one in level 4, and so on. Eventually you can obtain the magic key, which effectively gives you an infinite number of keys. That's really good because the later dungeons start to ramp up the required bombable walls. Now the tables have turned, and you're trying to conserve as many bombs as you can, not just because one could potentially be required, but also because bombs are legitimately one of the most useful combat items in the game, since they're your only means of attacking multiple enemies at once and without directly facing them. These aren't your only resources either. Of course, your health and healing ability are a resource, but your arrows are directly tied to your rupees, making money a big part of your combat capability too. Even on a smaller scale, the blue candle can only be used once per screen, making it its own micro-resource. Zelda 1 puts a heavy emphasis on challenging the player to not only utilize their resources correctly, but effectively too. A lot of other Zeldas attempt to do this, but very rarely do they do it as well as the first game. Now, can this resource management get tedious? Absolutely, especially in the overworld where most of the secrets are found with bombs in a section of the map that may or may not have a cave on it that could possibly take your cash as punishment for exploring too much. Honestly though, I think I'd prefer that tedium to the alternative, where every single wall that can be blown up is marked with an obvious crack, or where any time you're required to use arrows there's a convenient chest right next to it containing as many as you'd ever need. Yeah, it's tedious, but that's kind of the point. The tedium is a challenge to get better at the game, whether it be through effectively balancing your precious resources, getting good at the combat, or just through rote memorization of the map on subsequent playthroughs, the latter of which being what the game seems to expect you to do. Before we get any further, let me dispel what I think is the biggest misconception surrounding Zelda 1. No, this game is not open world, at least no more than a handful of other pre-Breath of the Wild Zeldas. What does that even mean, anyway? I always thought that open world just meant that the game's map is mostly continuous with very few if any loading zones or transitions, but not only would that make Zelda 1 not an open world, it would also make Wind Waker the first open world Zelda, not Breath of the Wild. Wikipedia defines open world as a virtual world in which the player can approach objectives freely as opposed to a world with more linear and structured gameplay, and then goes on to list The Legend of Zelda as an open world even though by its own definition that's incorrect. You certainly can do a lot of different things in Zelda out of order, but there's still plenty of structure in the game preventing you from being able to do things freely. For instance, in order to get the Triforce out of level 6, you first need to get the bow out of level 1, since it's required to beat Goma. You need the raft out of level 3 in order to enter level 4, you need the ladder out of level 4 in order to finish levels 5 through 7, and you need the recorder out of level 5 in order to enter level 7. Even outside of the dungeons themselves, there's a pretty major section of the overworld that's blocked off from you until you either obtain the ladder or learn a secret that you're only told through a poorly translated hint on the other side of the map that requires you to spend a specific amount of rupees in a cave that is obscured by a waterfall and is itself only told through a hint found in level 4. Okay, well, maybe I'm being too literal. Maybe some level of structure is allowed as long as it's not too overbearing. Well, in that case, A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds are also open world. You're allowed to do the majority of the dungeons out of order, it's just the first few that are strict. Okay, well, you could still get the MacGuffins out of the respective dungeons in any order in Zelda 1 if you just grab any required item out of previous dungeons and dip before getting the Triforce. Maybe that has something to do with it? Well, every Zelda up until Wind Waker lets you do that to an extent. Majora's Mask even directly acknowledges it. No matter what way you slice it, Zelda 1 does not let the player approach objectives freely, and that's exactly what makes it so great. Let me paint you a picture. You're playing through Zelda 1. You're not an expert on the game or anything, but you've finished it once before. You're probably going to go through the dungeons in the correct order just like last time, because why wouldn't you? They're clearly numbered for a reason, and that reason is because they all get sequentially harder. So you play through the game again, and every time you reach a locked door without a key, you think to yourself, man, the magic key would make this a whole lot easier. Once you finally get to level 8, you find the magic key and a huge wave of relief washes over you. You wish there was an easier way to get this key, but you have it now. And then you realize something. During your entire time playing this game, you've been running off the assumption that you needed items from earlier dungeons in order to progress through the later ones. For the most part, that's been true. Levels 5, 6, and 7 all pretty clearly required the ladder in order to get to the Triforce, and you thought that there were rooms in level 8 that required them too, but then you remembered that those rooms only had optional items in them. Turns out the only dungeon item that you actually needed in order to get the magic key was the bow, and that's not a particularly difficult item to get. So that gets you wondering, What other ways can I do things out of order? So you start the game again. This time, since you know the game better, you recognize that you have a choice in the matter. Starting out, the only levels that you can get the Triforce out of are 1, 2, and 3. Level 1 worked out for you last time, but unless you really want to get the magic key early, the items aren't exactly the most exciting in the world. Level 2 is by far the easiest dungeon in the game, both through combat and navigation, so if you're really struggling to fight enemies, the extra heart container might be nice. However, it's also pretty far out of the way and annoying to locate. On top of that, the only item in 2 is just the magic boomerang, an optional item that's a debatably worse variant to the regular boomerang found in level 1. 3 is a lot closer to the starting screen, and doing it next would give you the raft, which brings you one step closer to opening up the rest of the game. One problem, this is the first level with dark nuts in it. They hit hard, have movement patterns that are difficult to get the hang of, and with your current sword take 4 hits to take out. If you keep throwing yourself at them, you might eventually get through, but it might be worth it for early access to the late game items alone. Alternatively, you could also collect some more items in the overworld. The letter is really easy to get and would let you buy potions, which would make fighting dark nuts significantly easier. You could also grind a bit of money and buy the blue ring instead, which halves all damage taken. You could get the white sword, which doubles your attack, but that requires you to have at least 5 hearts. Last time you only got the white sword after you collected the heart containers out of levels 1 and 2, but this time you remembered that there are 5 extra heart containers scattered around the overworld. 2 of which you can obtain right now with bombs, and a third you can get if you buy a candle. You have so many options to approach the beginning of the game. Some of them make combat easier, some of them make exploring the world easier, some of them are riskier but quicker and more rewarding, and some of them are safer but slower and less rewarding. This continues into the late game too. Once you get the raft out of 3, you only gain access to a single heart container on the other side of the map as well as level 4, but inside level 4 you get the step ladder, and this lets you fully complete levels 5 and 6. Once you get the bow out of level 1, you can fully complete 8 too. All 3 of these dungeons are incredibly difficult, but in different ways that might entice the player to attempt one of them before the others. Level 5 is the first one with blue dark nuts, which deal more damage and have more health than their level 3 counterparts, but it also contains the first bomb upgrade and the item that lets you access level 7. Combat in level 7 itself is pretty easy, and the dungeon contains the second bomb upgrade and the improved candle, both of which make combat in dungeons 6 and 8 much easier. The problem is that while levels 5 and 7 are pretty easy combat-wise, the layouts are all rather confusing. On the other hand, level 8 is comparatively easy to navigate since there's this vertical shaft going through the center that the majority of the rooms directly stem from, and its item is immensely helpful for cutting down on the potential tedium of finding keys, which makes the other dungeons easier. But nearly every room in the dungeon is either populated by blue dark nuts or a boss fight. The magic rod contained in level 6 is an incredibly useful weapon, since it gives you an attack that reaches across the screen that doesn't require a resource or full health. In addition to that, the rod itself does white sword damage to enemies and can stack with whatever sword you have. It's perfect for dealing with nearly all the enemies in level 8, but it's guarded by both orange and blue wizrobes, which are some of the most difficult enemies in the entire game. They warp around, shoot projectiles that can't be blocked by your basic shield and deal a ton of damage, can hit you through walls and doorways, and always appear in a swarm. Worst of all, they're immune to nearly every attack other than the sword. The only other item that will damage them is the bomb, and you have a very limited supply of those. I bet you'd like to have more, huh? Alternatively, you could get the magical sword, which requires you to have at least 12 hearts. If you've completed every dungeon up until this point, you'll have 7 hearts, and there are another 5 found in the overworld. If you've done enough exploring, you're rewarded with the ability to have an easier time in the late game dungeons. Even if you missed a heart container, it's not the end of the world. Since each dungeon gives you a heart container, you could easily make up whatever containers you're missing by finishing the remaining dungeons. Just like in the first half, you have a set number of options, and each one helps with the remaining options in ways that suit whatever playstyle suits you the best. Doing things out of order isn't the point. The point is figuring out exactly how and why to do things out of order. Now imagine for a second if this structure didn't exist. Imagine if on your first time playing through this game you could obtain the magic key as soon as you start, no strings attached. Just stumble into the first dungeon that you can come across and grab the key out of it. It would ruin the rest of the game. Every dungeon after the first one would be significantly easier to navigate, not to mention there's no longer any sense of reward or discovery for figuring out exactly how to get the magic key. Now imagine if instead you immediately found the red candle, or if the magic sword was just handed to you because you happened to look around a bit further than expected. The game would be painfully unbalanced, and the only way they could possibly balance it again would be to strip down the actual utility of each item. Doing things out of order in Zelda works because it rewards the player's knowledge and skill, while also being structured enough that it matters. This is something that modern Zeldas fundamentally misunderstand. In those games you have so many options and nearly all of them are available from the start. There's almost never a reason to go to one area before another, and even when there is, it doesn't feel rewarding to do so. Just look at Breath of the Wild. What does it have? What does that game do to incentivize going in one direction over another? I guess there are the champion abilities, but those consist of slightly better shield, slightly better fairy, slightly better spin attack, and slightly less tedious way to climb mountains. None of these abilities affect the rest of the game in any specific ways, particularly not the divine beasts. At no point is there a moment that's specifically designed to be easier with Daruk's protection. In addition, none of these require any sort of prior knowledge to get early beyond the basic knowledge that they exist. This right here is why I take such an issue with the idea that Breath of the Wild was this return to form for the series just because it was open world or that it let you explore the map in whatever way you want. There's so much of an emphasis on freedom in the modern games that it ends up being a detriment. Zelda isn't about freedom. That was never what it was about. It was about exploration, about learning and memorizing the game and using that knowledge to your advantage. Trying to boil it down to this game lets you do things out of order is nothing more than a surface level understanding of what made The Legend of Zelda so great, and that's just modern Zelda in a nutshell. Now, do I disagree with the idea that Zelda was getting too linear in later entries? Not necessarily. A lot of what I love about Zelda 1 is certainly absent from most of the later classic games. I mean, there's a reason why I said that it's still my favorite 2D Zelda despite the fact that there have been 10 others since then. But most of those games aren't trying to copy the open-ended aspect of Zelda 1. Instead, every entry up until Skyward Sword took that basic progression system that Zelda pioneered in and played with it in different ways. Some of them work, some of them don't. Believe me, I'd prefer if we did get more games that were like the original, but first we need to understand that game design is a lot more nuanced than a simple matter of linear versus non-linear. Until then, I'm perfectly comfortable calling Zelda 1 the best 2D Zelda.